Hey everyone, today we're building this dissolve shader effect in the Godot engine inspired by Breath of the Wild. You'll be able to manually adjust the dissolve amount, change the direction of the dissolve, invert it, use it with and without a texture, and customize your glowing emission. I've set up a scene here with our little Godot mascot guy. Shout out to Hey Tebow for this awesome model. We're going to be creating a shader. So if you click on your mesh instance node, you might already have a material in your mesh or within your surface material override. I'm going to be putting mine in geometry material override. If you don't have anything here, do the new shader material. And within that, down here at the shader part, you're going to create a new shader. Now I've got a completely empty shader. Let's put something in here because right now we just have a gray blob. First, we're going to put our shader type. Now we're working within a 3D object. So in this case, it's going to be a spatial shader. Let's make that a little bit smaller. Then we have a couple of render mode settings that we want to add. First is cull disabled because we want both the outside and the inside of the mesh to render. Then we're going to do depth prepass alpha. This won't be clear right now, but when we add alpha transparency, it's going to get rid of our artifacts and we still get to have shadows, which is really cool. Next, let's add our fragment function. This is going to start with a void and then fragment. And within this, we can do a bunch of settings, including our albedo. We'll do our albedo equals vector 3, set this to red, and your little guy should now be red. If you see that, then your shader is working, and we can keep going. Let's make it so we can actually customize this within our parameters over here. So within a shader, you can always add a uniform. Think of this as an export variable that you would have within a script. We're going to have an albedo uniform. We're going to use the source color, which allows us to use a color picker and our inspector, and then we'll just have our default. With that saved over in the right side of our material, you should see something called shader parameters and now our new uniform. Now we can change this, but we have to obviously update our albedo setting, and now we can set this to albedo, and let's get the red, green, and blue channels from that. Your red guy should now be a gray guy. We can also add an alpha to our shader. If we set this value to 1, our mesh will be fully opaque. If we set this to a value of 0.5, our mesh will be partially invisible. And if we set it to 0, it will be completely transparent. Right now, we'll set this to 1. We'll be adjusting this in a little bit. Now, the dissolve effect is actually using a noise texture. And because we're working either from the top of the mesh to the bottom of the mesh, or vice versa, or from really any direction at all, we need to think about the space that the mesh is in. And the best way to do that is to think about it in world space. Every vertice within this mesh has a world position, and we can get access to that if we use the vertex function. Within the vertex function, we're going to get the world position with this right here. Now, in order to use this information within our fragment function, we need to use varying. This allows this information to pass into the fragment shader. With the world position information, we can now think about adding a very basic dissolve. The first thing we'll do is add 2 new uniforms, dissolve direction and dissolve amount. Think of the dissolve amount as an alpha. So 0 meaning no dissolve and 1 meaning completely dissolved. Using this information, we're going to create a mask within the fragment shader. We can do that by getting the normalized absolute direction of our dissolve and then multiplying those split values with our world position split values. Now we can use this dissolve mask as our alpha, which should give us a cutoff. You'll see here that if I adjust the dissolve amount, we now get a flat line that is slowly dissolving our character. Now it's not completely dissolving it because again, remember we're thinking in world space. And so we're gonna need to account for where our mesh actually is within world space. The step function here creates a sort of hard cutoff based on what our dissolve amount is related to the dissolve position. Now it's great that this is disappearing, but it's incredibly boring. What we need to do is add some noise to this to make it a lot more interesting. Now, if you've done shaders, you've probably done a noise sampler, and that probably was a 2D sampler. But in this case, we're going to use a sampler 3D. That means the noise is going to exist within 3D space, and it's going to look a lot better and not stretched out in a way that a 2D noise texture might. Then we're going to need a noise scale and then a noise strength. Back in the fragment function, we're going to adjust how we do our dissolve mask. First, we need to sample our 3D noise texture like so. We do that by using the texture function, using the noise texture, and then for our UV, we're not using the UV of our mesh, rather we're using the world position that we've gotten from our vertex shader. And then our noise scale allows us to expand or contract that size. We're also going to remap our noise, which typically goes from 0 to 1, to our noise strength, negative to positive. This allows us to make the dissolving edge go in both directions. Finally, we need a cutoff threshold, which is the dissolve amount plus our remapped noise. And then we plug that threshold back into the dissolve mask where we were originally just using our dissolve amount. If we go back to our mesh, we should now see a much more interesting line. And if we use our dissolve effect, we can see that that line changes because of the noise is changing. Now, in terms of what that noise texture should be, I'm using a 128 cubic pixel texture, and I kind of like the cellular noise type. There are obviously a lot of different variations that you can do. That's just kind of what I like for my effect. Our line is definitely more interesting, but it would be even more interesting if we made it glow. And the glowing is really what sells this effect. So we're going to add a glow using some edge detection. We go back into our shader. We're going to add some more uniforms. The first is an edge color primary. I say primary because in the next step, we're actually going to make a gradient. So this is just the first color that we're going to use. Then the width of the edge, and then the emission intensity, because this is going to be an emission. We're going to make it glow. Then back in the fragment function below our dissolve mask, we're going to add some edge floats. The first is an edge threshold, and that's going to be using the cutoff threshold. That is that line that we have for our dissolve. We're going to add our edge width to that and then create an edge mask based off of that threshold and the dissolve position. That's going to create a line just along that follows that same pattern. And then we just need to subtract that edge mask from the dissolve mask. That's going to give us just that line along that edge. And so if we take this and we plug it into our emission value, put that under our albedo, and we multiply that by our edge color and our emission intensity, we're going to get that glowy line. And now we're starting to look pretty cool, almost electrified, right? Now, if you're not getting that glowing effect, just make sure that your environment has that turned on. World environment, in fact, here are my settings. This is not, highly scrutinized or anything, but just something that I thought looked good at the moment. Now that we have this, we can customize the color. We can make it red, that blue, purple, whatever you want. I kind of like the blue. We're following that Breath of the Wild look. And you can change our width. You can make it really thick. You can envelop the entire mesh if you wanted to. I like something a little thinner, so I've gone with 0.01. And then intensity, that obviously adjusts our glow. So we already have something that looks pretty cool. Let's take this up a notch and make this single color into a gradient so we can customize the color even more. All right, so back in our shader again, we're going to add another uniform, this time for an edge color secondary. And then we're going to make some adjustments within the fragment shader. First, we're going to add an edge distance right below our edge mask here. That is the difference between the dissolve position and our cutoff threshold. Then we can get a gradient effect by clamping the edge distance divided by the edge width. In fact, if I plug that into our albedo, and then let's just get rid of our emission here, you'll notice that we have this slight gradient effect there that we can adjust, make it bigger, just like that. So we're going to use that gradient to mix between our primary and secondary colors. And then instead of using our primary color, within our emission, we're going to use our edge color. We pop that in there and save, and now we should be able to adjust the secondary color here. If I make the edge width bigger, we can really start to see that. So let's do just kind of like a fiery, there's that. And if we bring down our emission, we should be able to tell the difference a little bit. Yeah. There's our orange, and then our red. Now it looks like our Godot guy is like burning away. So that's just another variation on our color. Let's go back to the dissolve amount issue that we had earlier. And I had showed you that we're not actually dissolving the full mesh. And that's because we're using world space, and that just means we're going from 0 to 1 in world space. The problem with that is obviously our mesh is not of that size. Our mesh is bigger than that. And our mesh could move. So if I move this mesh down, you'll notice the dissolve doesn't follow it. That's because the dissolve is happening right there. Because that line, in fact, if I show you here, that line, that's 1. That's our height in world space of 1. So what we want to do is have that move with our mesh. Now we're actually gonna step out of our shader coding for a minute, and we're gonna have to make an actual script. You don't wanna have to manually set this within the shader. Your mesh could move. It's just a pain in the butt. So what we can do is use a tool script on our mesh to get the bounds of that mesh. And those bounds are gonna tell us how large that mesh is in world space, and we can pass that information to our shader. Now this part, I'm just gonna post this. I'm not gonna run through the script because then the video is gonna be like 40 minutes long. What I will do is post this for free in the description. You can grab it. But basically what this is doing is it's getting the bounding box of our mesh object. Of note, it's a tool script, so it's gonna be running in the editor. I have an update bounds button to manually update it when I want to. It also should update whenever you move the mesh, either in the game or within the editor. It also takes into account a couple of settings that we have within our shader. It adds a little bit of padding for the noise and the edge, but what this is gonna do in our shader is it's gonna update 2 new uniforms, and that is object min and object max. To use these 2 uniforms, we need to go back into our fragment function and find the cutoff threshold. Now, instead of just taking the dissolve amount, that is the value for our world position, we're going to use a mix of the object min and the object max, and then use the dissolve amount as the alpha. And obviously don't forget to add your remapped noise there as well. So now that we've added that to the shader, I've added that script to my mesh instance. It's running as a tool script. I will say sometimes you just need to like reload the project for that all to work. Tool scripts are kind of finicky sometimes. But now that we've done that, our dissolve is working. Now it's working within the bounds of this mesh. If I move the mesh, the dissolve goes with it, and it's going to go with it in any direction that I move it. If I change the dissolve direction, that's also going to follow it. And that's because we're now updating. In fact, you can notice in our inspector here, our object min and our object max are updating in real time. So if this were moving in the game, it would update that, and our dissolve is going to look correct. This is also a good time to show that you can, not just do an up and down dissolve, but you can do a left to right on the X axis, just like that. So we've fixed our bounding box issue, and this is a pretty good basic dissolve effect. We're going to add some additional advanced features. The first being an invert option. So let's say we wanted to flip this, because right now we're only working within the positive. If you notice, that's because we're doing an absolute value of this. If we do an invert, then we can have this go in the other direction. Maybe you want to dissolve it, going up instead of down. So let's go back to our shader, and we're going to add, we're going to add 1 uniform, and that is going to be an invert direction Boolean. Let's put that right there. We're going to reorganize all of these at the end. I'm going to have an invert direction that should pop up over in your shader parameters. Within the fragment function, after we sample the 3D noise, we're going to put a new float for the adjusted amount. This is going to use what is called a ternary operation. So what this is saying is it's a true and false check for our invert direction. So if true, we're going to use this value, and if false, we're going to use this value. And if you look at this, this is just a 1 minus, so we're flipping that dissolve amount. So after we add that, we need to update our cutoff threshold, so it uses the adjusted amount instead of the dissolve amount. And then after that, we're going to add an if statement, and that if statement is going to say if we are inverting our direction, set the dissolve position to minus dissolve position and the cutoff threshold to minus cutoff threshold. Just flipping those 2 things. And now that we've done that, we're going to use our invert direction here. And if we click, and just by clicking that, we can change what direction that is moving. The same goes for any other axis as well. The final thing we're going to add is a noise emission to the overall mesh. This is going to allow you to make the entire mesh glow and fade in using our noise and adding an emission to that while you're dissolving the whole thing. We'll go back to our shader and we're going to add, of course, some more uniforms. This will be a whole new section. And we're going to add a Boolean for using our noise emission. We're going to use a 2D sampler to get our color for a nice gradient effect, a scale, our emission intensity, and then the threshold, which is what we can animate to change how much of our mesh is glowing. Then we go back into our fragment shader after we calculate our edge right down here. Right before we do our albedo, we're going to use all of this. We're going to create a noise emission variable and then check whether or not we're using our noise emission. So that's that Boolean over here in our inspector. We're going to get our emission noise value, and that is sampling from our noise texture. That's the same noise texture that we're using actually for our dissolve effect. We're going to do another step function to get the mask. That is based on our threshold and our emission noise. And then finally, we're going to colorize the emission noise with our noise emission gradient for our gradient color. We can put all of that into our noise emission value, and then we need to adjust our emission value down here to account for our new noise emission. So I'll paste that in there. We're still getting our edge color, multiplying it by the edge and the emission intensity. That's all the same. We're just adding to it the noise emission value that we have, multiplying that, making sure we don't add to our edge. So that's our 1 minus edge, and then multiplying that by the emission intensity. So if I go into the inspector now, I turn on our noise emission and adjust our threshold. You'll see that we'll get this fading in glow from our noise texture. Change that intensity, and I set that emission scale way too high. That should just be a 1. So now we have this glowing spot. Now before I show you how I animate this, let's go ahead and clean up those uniforms like I promised. Just like you can do within a script, you can group your uniforms within your shaders, and that makes it a lot easier to look at within the inspector. I'll paste all of that in there and then save it. In order to create a group, you use the group uniforms and then the name of that group that you want to use. And just think of it like a tag. You got to have an opening to that tag and then an end to that tag before we start the next group uniform. And if you want to make a group a child of another group, then you're going to use the parent group name and then add a period, and then use the child name, just like I have here, dissolve, and then noise. And we close all that out. That's way, way, way easier to read than just a giant list of shader uniforms. So we've got all the pieces for our dissolve effect. How can you make this work together to create a cool looking effect? So you can actually animate individual shader parameters using an animation player, and that makes it pretty easy. So I've created a dissolve animation here. I'm just animating 2 of the parameters within our shader, the dissolve amount and the noise emission threshold. So by animating those within the animation player, you can get a pretty convincing effect. Just like that. Now, one final thing that we need to incorporate, that is the use of an albedo texture. So within our shader, we've added a albedo texture sampler and a use albedo texture Boolean. In order to account for that, we're going to go right above our albedo value here. We're going to set a base albedo and then another ternary operator for our Boolean. So if we're using the albedo texture, then we want to sample that texture, and if not, just use the color. And then the final albedo is the base albedo, and then we can also subtract the edge from albedo just to make sure it's black. With all that in place, we just need to swap out the old albedo value with the final albedo. Save that, and now there's our beautiful mascot again, and we can turn that off, go back to black. If you want to add a metallic and a roughness value, you can also do that very easily just by setting your metallic to a metallic uniform, and the same for the roughness. And that is your dissolve effect. So as always, you can get the source files, you can get the shader on my Patreon. Let me know if you want to see more shader tutorials like this. Thanks for watching, and as always, keep creating.